We're great. Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Schwartz. I'm the director of the IU Center for Bioethics, and it's my pleasure today to introduce our inaugural lecture in the IU Grand Round, Bioethics Grand Round series. The Center for Bioethics has hosted many talks in the past, and this year we decided to group together our most important and interesting ones, actually maybe just some of them, as a Bioethics Grand Round series. We have 6 planned for this year. We hope that you'll consider attending the future ones, which are all listed on our website. And you'll enjoy, hopefully, and engage with our community and with our overall goal of bringing together people interested in bioethics and related topics here in our city, at our university, and across the state. I also welcome our colleagues from other universities, especially part of the Indiana CTSI, who are online. All these lectures will be in person and also online. Today's lecture on race and medicine, what can we learn from genetics, is being presented by the perfect inaugural speaker for our series, Dr. Kyle Brothers, who comes to us and is an old collaborator and colleague from, he's not so old, but he's a longstanding collaborator and colleague from the University of Louisville School of Medicine, where he is the chief scientific officer at the Norton Children's Research Institute there. And we are just thrilled to have him talking us to today. And without further ado,
Thank you so much. Okay, thanks so much for those of you who are here in person, and thanks to all of you who are here virtually. It's really been a lovely visit to Indianapolis. We come up occasionally to go to the Children's Museum and do stuff like that, but it's really wonderful to see very nice people and spend time with you. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk today about, first I'm going to get rid of my picture so I can't see myself. There we go. I'm going to be talking today about race and medicine. A key issue that sort of is very active in the minds of many physicians these days and kind of longstanding in society is the biological basis of race, or as we like to say, the non-biological basis of race. So there have been some empirical research done to look at folks who have been exposed to ancestry testing and how that might shape the way they view race. And the evidence shows that many people, when they get exposed to that kind of information, they end up having an increase in their perception about the biological basis of race. So they think race is biological. But this talk is basically going to argue that is a misunderstanding of what's happening with ancestry tests. And hopefully we can use that to make some conjectures about what that means for the practice of medicine. Okay, first we're going to start off with some definitions, and I'm going to go through a very brief update on genetics. Things have sort of changed from the time when I was in medical school, where we were taught classical genetics. So I wanted to give kind of an update on that. We're going to talk about how genetic ancestry testing works and what that means.
Growing up, we were German.
Okay. I'm not 100% sure people online will be able to hear this, but let's try.
We danced in a German dance group. I wore lederhosen. When I first got on Ancestry, I was really surprised that I wasn't finding all of these Germans in my tree. I decided to have my DNA tested through Ancestry DNA. The big surprise was we're not German at all. 52% of my DNA comes from Scotland and Ireland. So I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt.
Ancestry has many paths to discovering your story. Get started for free at ancestry.com.
So first of all, coincidence that this character's name is Kyle, and mine is as well. Second of all, this is one of the most wrong-headed commercials that's ever been on television, and I'm going to explain why. Okay. So genetic essentialism. This is the notion that genes can reveal to us the core of what it means to be a human, and also what it means to be an individual separate from other humans. And this is a insidious force in healthcare and in society. And I think it's helpful to dig deep into genetics to really understand why it's so problematic. So I want to ask, what can genetic ancestry tell us about our identity and heritage? Why Kyle is so horribly wrong? And what does that mean for us about race? Okay, a few words about our genomes. Many of us, when we learned genetics, we were taught this Mendelian framework where there's sort of alleles, and there's sort of two versions of the alleles, and you can inherit them in a dominant or recessive fashion. And because many of us learn genetics that way, we project that to assume that's what all of human genetics is about, and that is not at all what's going on in most of the genetics in the human body. And in fact, when we see ancestry testing, we assume they sort of are looking at alleles for features like skin tone or something like that help tell them what what ancestry a person is. And actually, that's not true either. There has nothing to do with any of the phenotype of a human being. So let's look at what they are doing. So just some. Can I hide this upper thing, Nick? There we go. Well, anyway, it's okay. So the most important parts of our genomes don't vary much. So in fact, if you look at parts of our genomes that are the most important, we will actually share those pieces with plants, fungi, insects, etc. In fact, one of the things that labs do when they're trying to understand whether a change in the genome might affect health is they actually look and see what are the parts of the genome that are conserved from other species like chimpanzees. And because if we have a change from those shared things, that's probably going to be disease causing because these very important pieces don't change, right? Disease causing variants, which we don't call mutations anymore, because it's not really that there's something right that went wrong. It's just that we're all different. They are typically those that occur de novo, which means from new. They are new things that occurred in the development of an embryo. And rare variants are inherited by a small number of people. So you either have de novo things that pop up for the first time in a person that causes a disease, or there are rare variants that are inherited by a small number of people, like cystic fibrosis, and cause a disease. So that most of disease affecting genes fit into this category. Truly harmful variants, those that create sort of a childhood illness, aren't common. There are common variants that affect health, things like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, etc. But each of those variants typically have a very small effect on that outcome. So it's not that you have this variant, so therefore you're going to get this disease. It's this variant marginally increases your risk a very small amount. And it's only the accumulation of these common variants that might affect your overall risk. So these are the kinds of differences that make us distinct from one another as humans. As you know, human diversity is one of the great things about humanity. And these genetic differences among common variants are the things that tend to make us different from one another. Common variants are typically present in every population throughout the world, but they occur at different frequencies. So when we think about how one population is different from another population, it's not that this population has a bunch of stuff this other population doesn't have. It's that they share a lot of these common variants, but one has a higher rate of one variant than the other. And that's actually why groups of people are different from one another. So ancestry testing tends to look at what's called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. There are several 100,000 of these in the human genome, and these are single point locations where a single nucleotide could be one thing or the other, and typically it's that way throughout the entire human population, okay? There are a small subset of these where there's three possibilities. It could be A, G, or T, but in the vast majority of cases, it's one or the other, A or G. So in most cases, the two or all three of the variants found at these SNP locations are present in every population throughout the world, but they vary in their frequency, which we call allele frequencies. Okay, so this is just a little schematic to show you what allele frequencies look like. Let's say we're looking at that particular location. There's just one nucleotide, and you look at different populations. So each circle is a population in the human species. In one population, maybe A and G are pretty equal. They have a 50% of A, 50% G. And then maybe in other populations, A is relatively uncommon. And then maybe there are a few populations where everybody is a G, okay? So with that background, let's talk about how ancestry tests work. So let's just think about a person. Oh, I should have put A and G here instead of A and B. But think about a person who inherited an A from one parent and a G from the other. Okay. Which populations could that person be from? They could be from the first, second, or third population, but not the fourth, right? But which population are they more likely to be from? The one that has an equal distribution, right? Because it would be relatively uncommon in the third population that has mostly Gs, it would be relatively uncommon to inherit both, okay? So that's how ancestry tests work. You do that 10,000 times, okay? You go through these single SNP locations and you say, what are the chances this person is from this population? What are the chances this person is from this population? And then you just do that over and over again, and the computer adds up the chances, okay? There is a second way, a slightly more modern way to do this, which is based on haplotypes. So a haplotype is a sequence of SNPs that are not physically located next to each other in the genome, but are located near each other in the genome, and that are found on a single copy of a chromosome. So in this image, you can see there's 3 individuals. There in this segment of DNA, there's 5 SNPs, and you could look at the pattern of those 5 SNPs. So each of these people have a different haplotype at this location, okay? So just like individual SNPs, haplotypes occur with different frequencies in different populations. And a haplotype might be relatively unique to one population. So because there's different frequencies for each of these SNPs, these 5 in a series might tend to only happen in that one population. So haplotypes are distinctive patterns of SNPs that are individually common throughout the entire human population. The individual pieces of a haplotype are very common, and they're typically not relevant to health or any other phenotype. They're literally just changes in the junk part of the DNA, okay? They don't have no biological meaning. So they're typically not right next to each other. So we're not talking about a T and a G right next to each other. We're talking about in the genome with kind of segments of things that are the same for all of us. They're kind of in series, and they're more likely to be inherited together because segments of DNA are inherited together, okay? Okay, so ancestry estimates are based on SNPs alone or in combination as haplotypes that are individually found in all groups, okay? These things are individually found throughout all of the human population, but the frequencies vary. So the fact that companies can estimate ancestry using genetics doesn't mean that these groups are particularly distinctive from one another. The vast majority of their genomes are identical, or that these differences have medical implications, okay? So even though we see this ancestry test and we think, oh, our genomes are so different from one another, this company can tell the difference. In fact, they're all very similar to each other, and this is just a probability game, okay? So let's apply this to race. And I think it would just be helpful to think about an American individual who self-identifies as Black. Okay, so let's think about genetic diversity for just a second. And there's 2 ways in genetics you might think about genetic diversity. One is heterozygosity. So heterozygosity means at a particular SNP, you have A or B, okay? So you might have inherited an A and from your mom, an A from your dad. You might have inherited a G from your dad, a G from your mom. But if you got A from one parent, G from the other, then you're heterozygous at that location, okay? So you can look throughout a person's genome and then all of those individuals in a population and see how common is it for a person to inherit one from one parent and a different one from the other parent. And then you can tell how diverse is this population, because in populations that are not very diverse, most people at most locations are going to have the same. It's going to be A and A, right? The other way, this is just showing that, reminding you that because of these probabilities that things show up in different frequencies, you can infer from individual people what the whole population looks like. Okay, the other way you can think about it is there are some SNPs that are biallelic. There's 2 different options, or triallelic. There's 3 different options in one population. But then every other population in the world, everyone shares exactly the same thing. Okay. So populations that have a lot of private alleles are more diverse. Okay. So, yeah, in this case, maybe there's a population where if we look at this particular SNP, some people have A, some people have G, but if you look at every other population in the world, it's just G. Okay. It's not even a SNP. It's just the same in everybody. So these populations that have a lot of private alleles are the more diverse ones. Okay. So these are populations from around the world. The yellow groups are from the continent of Africa. So I don't think you can see that. Can you see that? Yeah. This is heterozygosity. The heterozygosity in populations in Africa is much higher than the rest of the world. Genetic diversity on the continent of Africa is much higher than all the rest of the populations of the world. This is another one. Again, yellow is Africa. These are private alleles. So locations where a population in Africa has either an A or a G, but the whole rest of the world is just A. Okay. You can see there's an extremely large number of private alleles in African populations. And the explanation, as you all know, for historically is that there are a lot of diversity on the continent of Africa. A subset of folks from Africa migrated out and populated the rest of the world, right? So all those possibilities, all that diversity didn't move out of Africa, only a subset of it moved out of Africa. So this is a map sort of projecting amount of diversity around the world. And you can see there's a lot of diversity in Africa. There's much less diversity in the whole rest of the world. So African ancestry groups reflect more genetic diversity than the rest of global ancestry groups combined. Okay. So if you pick two random folks who live on the continent of Africa, they are going to be, by chance, less genetically similar than two people from any other part of the world. Okay. And as a matter of fact, the two people from Africa might be more dissimilar from each other than one of them is from a person from Europe or a person from Asia. Okay. There's more genetic diversity in Africa than the whole rest of the world. So race is a way of thinking about groups of people based on sociopolitical categories. But in our heads, we tend to cast that as a biological thing. And so we even use very confusing language like African American to describe races, but in fact, they don't correspond very well with genetic ancestry in the way that we expect. So show you all the better. You see the headline here. So this is self-identified Black Americans by state, looking at the mean contribution from different continents. Okay. So you can see people who self-identify as Black. If you look in different states, their African ancestry may range from 0.65, 65%, up to over 80%. Okay. If you look at the bottom here, if you look at the European contribution to people who self-identify as African American or as Black, you get from 0 to more than 30%. Okay. So even though in our heads, and we even use words that say people who self-identify as Black are from Africa, in fact, the folks that we identify as Black in this country based on socio-political categories actually have a lot of diversity in their genetics. And remember, the part that's from Africa is actually more diverse than the whole rest of the world combined anyway. Just to show you that this works multiple ways. Yeah, here it is. This is self-identified white Americans. The scales on these are different from the previous scales, so it kind of makes it confusing. But you can see there's also diversity within the European populations. Okay, or within white populations, there's diversity in the ancestry. Okay, so Americans reflect a significant amount of genetic admixture. Race and ancestry don't correlate conceptually. They're not the same thing in our heads, but just as importantly, they don't correlate biologically. So, you all with me? We doing okay? All right. I know you invited me to talk about ethics, Peter. So here, finally getting from genetics to ethics. Okay. It has been very common throughout the history of medicine in the US to use race as a way of organizing people and informing decision making. So these are graphs, the details are probably not necessary, showing that neonatologists have used for decades to estimate the chances of survival based on the gender and race of the infant. Okay. So this is based on data from, the studies that generated these graphs. The survival for a Black female versus a white male is more than twice. The chances of survival of a Black female is more than twice that of a white male in the NICU. Okay. Why is that? Well, I don't know why, but it's not about biology, right? We already have shown that these people don't correspond from an ancestry perspective in the way that we expect. This is almost certainly driven by social determinants of health. So this is just an example of race being used in pattern recognition in clinical care, which is a very common practice, but it's deeply problematic. So we're going to talk about 8 reasons using race in medicine is problematic. For those of you with philosophy backgrounds, you're going to see some of these are actually saying the same thing, but it's actually helpful to say them in slightly different terms because it helps us see things differently. Okay. So number 1, self-reported race is not dependably associated with genetic ancestry. Okay. So that's one reason it's problematic to use race in medicine, because we're not really talking about ancestry in the way that we think. Perceived race is even worse. So if a person walks in the clinic and a person at my front desk classifies that person based on what they think they are, that's even worse, right? I've talked to my front desk. That's what they do. They say it's super awkward to ask about race, so we just put in what we think. Okay. From a genetic perspective, individuals with African ancestry are more dissimilar from one another than they are from members of other ancestral groups. Okay. So when we see a person who self-identifies as Black in the US, the component of their ancestry that is inherited from Africa is nothing specific, right? Because there's so much diversity in Africa. We really can't make any inferences based on our assumptions of race about what the contribution of ancestry from Africa or any other continent is. American residents reflect a significant amount of genetic admixture, which is to say ancestry from more than one location. So making assumption that this person fits into that group is not easy to make. Okay, number 5. Oh, just continuing number 5. The evidence suggests that admixture is especially true for persons who identify as white, Black, or Hispanic in the US. So-called founder effects might be relevant for persons whose recent ancestors are from a single population, such as a specific island in the Pacific or from an Amish community, these groups that are sort of separated from others. And we know that both parents for a person are from a population like that. That can be useful as a rule of thumb in practice, but not for folks who are in the larger, more admixed groups, white, Black, Hispanic. Using race is practically worthless from a genetic perspective. Number 6, diagnoses driven by racial assumptions will exclude important possibilities. So this is a report from pediatrics in which an 8-year-old girl who's Black was failed to be diagnosed with cystic fibrosis for 8 years. The only time what finally ended up getting her a diagnosis is a radiologist saw another radiologist's images from an X-ray and said, "Hey, who's the kid with CF?" So only the person who didn't see a Black child is the person who recognized CF. Picking up what I'm putting down here? Okay. How many times a day does this happen throughout our healthcare system all across the country? Things don't line up the way I expect them to, so therefore I make a bad assumption. Okay. Medical conditions, including genetic conditions, don't track with race in the ways we tend to assume. And this is a great image of that. This is a frequency of alleles that cause the condition sickle cell. Think in your head about a sickle cell patient. Now look at the slide. It does not correspond in the way that we think it does. Folks from Northern Africa, their risk might be exactly the same as a person from Europe. For folks from different areas of India, their risk might be the same as folks from Africa. But because we make assumptions from race to ancestry, we miss the possibility that we're going to pick up on sickle cell in patients who have no risk or have a high risk. Okay. Yeah, when we use race in clinical pattern recognition, we tend to reinforce our own incorrect assumptions about biological basis for race. And therefore, it sort of creates this cascading effect in everything that we do, where we're making other assumptions about how folks are different from one another, and that's somehow biological or born into them. Yeah, in the US context, risks for medical conditions are not the same between patients who identify as Black and those who identify as white. There are generations of research showing over and over and over again, the risks for conditions are not the same for those who are Black versus those who are white. But because we don't think about systemic racism as a driver of these differences, many implicitly assume much of this difference is biology. It's sort of in our genetics, but it's not. It's in the way the society and the way that systemic racism is ingrained in society creates risk for these conditions. Yeah, but we know almost all this difference is due to social determinants of health, which has mechanisms of systemic and interpersonal racism. After all, we've already shown individuals with different self-identified race do not differ from one another genetically in the way genetic essentialism would cause us to assume. So it must be social determinants of health. Okay, this is my last slide. I think in general, it's probably fine to use genetic ancestry tests. But remember, human beings are far more than their genes. Don't be tricked into thinking you're so different from someone else because the percentage of Scottish ancestry is different on this test, right? It doesn't mean anything. And for people like Kyle, let's just think for 30 seconds about why is it that Kyle thought he had ancestry from Germany, but in fact, he had ancestry from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Maybe his great-grandfather adopted a child, right? Maybe his last name, Merker, if you look, that is a German last name, right? So are those people irrelevant to his heritage? Of course not. He does have German heritage if that was passed down through his family. The fact that his genetics don't show that is irrelevant, okay? So Kyle is subject to genetic essentialism in the same way many of our healthcare providers are, and we're not walking around in kilts, but we're still making mistakes. So we need to learn, like Kyle, that's not, destiny is not in our genes. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, how are we on time? Yeah. Okay.
I've got a lot. First, I think what's the story?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, great question. Okay, I'm just going to summarize really quickly. There's a comment about it's super interesting. I completely agree that the story of Kyle really demonstrates the way in which the politics of these issues is reflected in the way we interpret things. Completely agree. The other question is, I said there are haplotypes that are more common or may even be unique to particular populations. And what can we read into that? What can we learn from looking at haplotypes about the history of individual groups? Is that fair? Okay, great. So for those of you who are in medicine, who was taught in medical school that Black men have increased hypertension because in Africa, there's not a lot of salt. In the US, they're exposed to salt. I was taught that too. There's a very closely related hypothesis. I use that term very loosely, that in fact, the problem is that there was a selective pressure during the Middle Passage, so the transport of African individuals in the slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean, that folks who had certain variants to hold on to salt were more likely to survive, and therefore Black populations in the US have this genetic risk for hypertension. Poppycock, right? There is absolutely no evidence to support that. And as a matter of fact, as you can imagine, folks have gone looking for these genetic changes and they are not present. Okay. So this is just a perfect example of what you're talking about, Colin, where folks assume that because these haplotypes are here, there's some sort of like historical effect that created that, right? That it's not. You can look at numerous examples and you'll always come up empty. So the reason that these haplotypes can occur in a relatively unique way in a population is simply because of founder effects. So you have the world's biggest founder effect, which is not all of the diversity of Africa made it out when the world was peopled by folks from Africa, right? So you got a founder effect there, and you get these multiple other founder effects as groups cross the Bering Strait, enter Europe. So you obviously get migration and intercommunication of populations over history. So it's certainly not clean in the way that sometimes we assume they are. But fundamentally, these patterns of a few haplotypes, are kind of unique. That just comes from this history of groups of people, a subset of the diversity in a population moves to another place. That's simply it. Yeah. Yeah. So, oh yeah, thank you so much. So the question was about ApoL1. Yeah, ApoL1. There's been some research that implies it may not explain hypertension, but it might explain the progression of hypertension in Black Americans to needing dialysis. I don't know about the specific gene, but what I can say is geneticists have a habit of using heuristics to estimate the heritability of traits that they attribute to genes. Okay. But, if you were to add up the causation in like 100% causation, what are the elements that comprise that? You would say, oh, this amount of causation is from genetics. This amount of causation is sort of not heritable, so we assume it's from the environment. And you added all that together, you would get like 500%, right? Because causation doesn't operate in that way. It's not a linear thing. There's social determinants of health that are influenced by systemic racism and other effects. There's genetic predispositions. And if you can have genetic risk, you can have a social determinant of health that when they occur together in the same person, they do lead to an outcome. But if you had that genetic change and you were not exposed to that social determinant of health, you would not have that outcome. So, fundamentally, I would say, I don't know the particular case, but I would just be very skeptical about any attribution of a cause to a gene, because every gene only has an effect within an environment. And that's how biology works. Yes, Nick. Yeah, perfect question. I should have just planted that question. So the question was, it sounds like I'm saying we should just get rid of race and use other kinds of things. What were you suggesting we would use instead? Yeah, like maybe we should use just genetic ancestry. Like maybe when people walk in our clinic, we should just test their ancestry and that'll tell us a lot more. Yeah. So I do think we should stop using race in the way that we do in the practice of medicine. The risk, I know you know this, Nick, but the risk, if we sort of like pretend like race doesn't exist, is that we will see social determinants of health and the way they affect people, and we will ignore the fact that those social determinants of health are just mechanisms through which systemic racism operates, right? So we'll see, oh, this poverty thing is really horrible. It's causing high blood pressure and high cholesterol. And we'll completely miss the fact that that is not distributed like equally in our population, right? And you could do the same thing with 1,000 other social determinants of health. So I really don't think we should eliminate the use of race in our science. We need race so that we can see how systemic racism affects the world. I do think when a patient walks in the door, we should ignore race. We should ignore the way that we assume ancestry functions. And if we think a person has a lung condition and there's a possibility that could be cystic fibrosis, we should just check for cystic fibrosis. We should just order a genetic test and look. Because, yeah, I mean, as I kind of probably drove you crazy saying over and over again, if we make assumptions that this person might or might not have a cystic fibrosis variant, then we're going to get it wrong very frequently. And I honestly don't mean we should truly ignore race because, of course, our patients interact with the world. They are perceived through their race. And so therefore, all sorts of things that they need to be successful with their health are going to be affected by their race. So, of course, we're going to think about it as a mechanism in social determinants of health and what our patients need, but we're not going to use it to make assumptions about fundamental biology and how people are different. Yes.
Okay, now we're good. But it's been a
Yes.
right. So when I was in that,
yeah. Uh-huh. Yes.
Now it's not.
Yes.
I think what you're
saying.
You know, race is a marker.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the question was, we used to have 45-year-old white male start of our note. Many doctors stopped doing that. Unfortunately, many have not stopped, but many have stopped doing that. And maybe it's now goes in our exam where we say like, this is a black male or something. Maybe we're even more circumspect and say something like with dark skin tone or, but then many are arguing we should just completely remove it. But then the question remains, how do we think about the social determinants of health and the way that those correspond to race in our practice? And does that end up in the note? So I have two pieces. One, I just want to say something that's relatively obvious, which is when we put race in our notes, 45-year-old white male, we typically either looked in the medical record to see what was documented, or we just made a guess, right? Person came in, they look black to me, okay, black male. So if we are going to use race in some way, we should do it rigorously, and therefore we should ask, how do you identify yourself? The best possible way is asking open-ended like that. If you're going to ask us like a multiple choice question, there has to be some pretty robust options, which is a whole mess in itself. Okay, so then the other issue. Should we even have it there at all, since we do want to think about social determinants of health? I think the big risk is that we tend to say race, but then we don't clarify why we're using or what we mean by that. And we often will use euphemisms or we'll completely ignore and not use the words like racism. And I think if we are going to talk about race in our notes or in other settings, we should frame it, explicitly explain, because I'm concerned about the effects of systemic racism in this case. So yeah, I guess in a one-liner, don't talk about race, talk about racism, because then you're not creating the sort of world where racism doesn't exist. You're reminding everybody racism does exist. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to summarize that. And it's brilliant. So the comments from a dermatologist for the online audience about the role that melanocytes play in the tone of the skin and how that is very limited to just the melanocytes and doesn't affect the whole rest of the skin structure, which I completely agree with. And I think you're exactly right. One thing just a comment is you're aware of what is called the one drop rule, right? So this is a rule of thumb that Americans have used for maybe more than 2 centuries to say this person is Black, this person is white, okay? And in general, a person who is perceived to have any darker skin tone is assigned the Black category, and people with lighter skin tones are assigned the white category, right? When you look at the genetics of white people and Black people in the US, it is really not, when you look at the big picture of that, they just look like a big clump that makes a line, okay? If you sort of break them apart so you can see who self-identifies as white and who self-identifies as Black, there's an end of that kind of line, that kind of clump, where all the people who identify as white are, who have European ancestry. And then there's this sort of like spectrum of people who self-identify as Black, who have admixture of European, African, and other kinds of ancestry. But we can only see that separation because we already know the one drop rule. It lives in our brain, right? And doesn't pay rent, right? So, but if you just look at the genetics, this is just a clump, right? And skin tone is a perfect example of that. It is not only something people use to assign race. It is the mechanisms you're talking about are a spectrum. They are not dichotomous, right? So, I mean, it is very helpful to understand like the way in which we use sort of phenotype, in this case, skin tone, in the way that we assign race. But also remember that that causes us to see people as sort of separating out into two groups. But if you were just to use a photo of the skin tone, or if you would use the genetics, you wouldn't be able to see a difference there. You would just see a spectrum. Perfect comment. Thank you. Yeah, Colin.
I wanted to pick blank board.
Uh-huh.
Which I thought was
Yes. Yes.
but just
Yes.
where's mine? Where's
Mhm.
mine?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you all know, Colin and I are academic siblings. So everything he says, I'm like, this guy's a genius. I'm going to summarize. So first, you commented what I think is completely right, that there are many ethics consults where the interpersonal racism or perceptions of interpersonal racism, and in some cases, more systemic forms of racism, are the key issue, and we ignore them because we leave out the race, or we sort of like hide it. And I completely agree with you. I think we should be super forthright about what explicitly happened, and also our interpretation as a person who lives within the society about what's happening. So I think it's totally okay to say this family was Black, and I think perceptions of interpersonal racism played a role here. I think we should just be super explicit and use those terms. The other comment, which is also brilliant, is we have large data sets. We use all different kinds of analytical techniques, and we see that there are certain genetic variants or biomarkers, as you said, that are more common or that are associated with outcomes like IQ test or educational attainment or other kinds of things. And then we can sort of attribute those biomarkers to populations, and we start to think like, oh, these are kind of like baked in things to these populations. Fundamentally, because they're not, we can't interpret causation from this data in that way. All we can say is these things are associated with each other. And because the biomarker is so bio, we assume that this is like the bio could not have been caused by interpersonal racism. So this must be baked in, and therefore it leads to this outcome. But in fact, it is almost always the other way, but we can never see it that way. This is fundamentally the same issue Peter was talking about earlier with APOL1, right? There's gene by environment interactions. And we think of genetics as immutable, So any differences or changes are going to be attributed to the environment, because the genes are always the same, and that's sort of determinative. Something could not have caused the genes. It must be the genes causing everything else. But I completely agree that error is made over and over and over again every day in science, where we assume biological causes and sort of medical or environmental effects, but in fact there's so much going on there. There are articles all the time. Sometimes the science itself frames it this way, but sometimes it's just the news interpretation of the science. It basically says risk for depression is hardwired into our brains, because we can find the biological structural correlates of some trait on an MRI. And therefore we say it's hardwired, like it must have been that this thing caused this thing, instead of, of course, conditions that have to do with effects on the brain can be picked up by things looking at the brain. Why do you think the brain has a difference there, right? So, but we can't ever infer causation there. So we just assume like, oh, this must be kind of baked in because the brain is the brain, So yeah, completely agree. Yes, Tom.
So I have a pretty. I just know that. It's I just continue.
Yeah, which is the question, I think. So I'm going to say this for people online, and feel free, people online, to enter your thoughts on the chat. Question is, why does this continue? If it's so, the science is so clear that the differences in individual patients that we attribute to race are not caused by genetics, they're caused by social determinants of health. Why do we keep making that mistake over and over again? So I don't have an answer to that. I'd love to hear what you all think, and people online, feel free to jump in with some thoughts. I joked about it, but you noticed it took me more than half of my talk to get to the point where we could talk about why ancestry doesn't mean people are really fundamentally different, right? I don't think that concept is super straightforward. So we sort of get sensitized to these multiple reminders about how different people from different races are so different from one another, which we attribute to sort of fundamental things, right? Biology. And the explanation about why that's false really takes some time to dig into, right? It takes some deconstructing work. And I think that is one mechanism. It's sort of like vaccine hesitancy, right? It's easy to say why you should not get a vaccine. It's hard to explain why you should get a vaccine. Like, oh, we've had the MMR vaccine for decades, and people are still getting measles. So why should I get it, right? And it's like, well, let's look at the rates of measles over time. It's like really impossible to explain that. I'm sorry, I know you're a philosopher, but for the most part, people don't think that way anyway, right? They don't think rationally. They're kind of like just exposed to these, shadows on the wall, and we just sort of like interpret how we're going to interpret it. So yeah, and I say this all the time, and like there are things baked in here, right? Like I grew up a Protestant. I don't really practice religion anymore, but Protestantism lives here. And I will never not have Protestantism living up there, right? I was brought up in a highly segregated, race-based society, and race still lives here. And I can give this talk 1,000 times and I'll still see race, and it'll be hard for me to unbake that, right? So I just think it takes work. Yeah, Tom. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I think that's super interesting. The comment was basically there's work going on here funded by the NSF to teach high schoolers, instead of teaching them Mendelian genetics, to teach them sort of genomics, modern genomics about multi-factor genetics, and that it really has a strong effect on genetic essentialism, which I think is totally awesome. And I think NSF should fund you more. That's all I know, but I'm still going to say it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question is about there is an assumption there genes are kind of what they are. They're always the same throughout our life, but in fact, there's all these other biological mechanisms that we're well aware of that through stress and other factors that create changes in gene expression. That I mean, and there's epigenetics, which we don't understand super well yet, but it sure seems that some of these changes could be heritable for some period of time, even if they're not actually in the gene sequence, but they're actually just in the expression of genes. I think that might be one of the most important areas of science today, that it needs so much more work, because there is very clear evidence at sort of the epidemiological level that there is very strong heritability in many of these effects of social determinants of health, right? A mom who is stressed has babies who have certain kinds of effects. And often we don't know what the mechanism was. We just know it happened, right? Same thing with health disparities. We know the disparities happen. We just often don't study the mechanisms. So I think that could be shared environment. It could be, it could be that stressed moms are exposed to stressful environments. The baby is also exposed to a stressful environment. So maybe that's what's happening. Could there be things that are more ingrained that sort of stick with people? So this is my dream, is that if we could better understand these mechanisms by which things are inherited, then we could convince everybody who thinks we just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and it's just about our own personal responsibility that no, we don't all start at the same place. We don't all have the same likelihood of being able to achieve certain kinds of outcomes. And it's not just that, one person's parents have more money in the bank than the other person's parents. There's all these other ways in which, benefit and success or whatever the outcome is not merely a matter of personal responsibility. It's all this other stuff. But again, it goes back to the stuff that's, even if we understand it, explaining it to people is super hard. But I think it's worth doing. Yeah, thank you.